Hi everyone, we'll just wait a few minutes for people to get here and join us and sort out our slideshows. We'll start in a few minutes. Hey, hi, welcome everybody. Welcome to this very special event. This is part of the CBA Festival of Archaeology Week. And we're very excited to be showing to you today a premiere of a film called Stonehenge 3019, which is a film made by some young people who live in the area around Stonehenge. They made it last year, and they made it to imagine what Stonehenge would look like 1,000 years from now. And what we're going to do today is show you the first ever viewing of that film. But before that, we're going to be having a chat about some of the themes in the film, and we're going to be meeting one of the young people who was involved in making that film. And we're also going to be talking about themes of climate change and environment and heritage. Now, what we're doing here today is part of the English Heritage Shout Out Loud project, which is funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund, and it's part of their Kick the Dust programme. So it's a really exciting project which basically gets lots of young people involved in heritage and involved in English heritage sites and collections, and particularly young people from backgrounds who wouldn't normally get involved in heritage. So it's a really exciting project, and this is just one of many strands that Shout Out Loud have been running over this week and over the last year and into the future. Okay, so who have I got with me? I'm very pleased to welcome Maya Rose Craig and Matthew Law. Do you want to introduce yourself, Scott? Oh, actually, you know what? First, I ought to introduce myself properly. I'm Susan Greeny, and I'm an archaeologist, and I work for English Heritage in Bristol. And I work particularly with Stonehenge a lot. Over to you, Matt. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Matt Law. I am a lecturer at Barnsley University, and I also work for a commercial archaeology company called LP Archaeology. I'm an environmental archaeologist, which means that I study how environments have changed through time, and in particular, I work with snails to understand how people have altered the landscape.
Great. And Maya Rose, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, I'm Maya Rose Craig. Wait, no, I'm Dr. Maya Rose Craig. I'm 18 years old and I'm an environmentalist and climate change activist. And I've been going out into nature since I was a baby, and about 5 years ago, I started doing work to bring diverse communities into the countryside and give them that opportunity to engage with nature. But I have very strong personal links to the anti-climate change movement because I'm half Bangladeshi and a lot of my family lives in Bangladesh, and obviously they're suffering massively because of it.
Great, thanks for being here, both of you. Both doctors, although I'm not a doctor, so you're both winning in that sense. So what we're going to do today, the way it's going to work, is we're going to have a bit of a chat about Stonehenge and the landscape around Stonehenge. I'm going to talk about Stonehenge and its landscape today. And then I'm going to pass over to Matt, who's going to talk about archaeologists and how we find out about the environment and landscape in the past. Then what we're going to do is have a few bits of questions and answers, and we're going to present to you the first 3 minutes of the Stonehenge 3019 film, because that will give us a really nice sense of what the film's about and some of the themes, and then we'll have a bit of discussion. But we also want you to get involved. So what we'd like you to do is ask questions of us. You can type them into the YouTube comments below the screen, and there are some behind the scenes elves who will be collecting those questions together, and they'll be feeding them through to me so that you can get your questions answered. And we'll have a chunk of time towards the end of the session before we show the film where you can have some of your questions answered, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. Okay, so to start off, what we're going to do is I'm going to talk and show some slides which talk about Stonehenge and its landscape today. So if the person with the slides could share them now, that'd be brilliant. Okay, so they're not coming up. Oh, they are. Perfect. So if we go to the picture of Stonehenge, that'd be brilliant. Yeah. Okay, so I think we're having trouble making these bigger. So I'm afraid if you can't see them great on your screen, shouldn't matter too much. Hopefully you'll be able to see a little bit of them anyway. So Stonehenge, for those of you who don't know, it's a monument that was built about 4,500 years ago in a period that we call the late Neolithic, so the end of the Stone Age. It's a unique site. It's a World Heritage Site. It means it's very well known. It's an icon. It's the centre of a huge amount of international tourism, usually, not at the moment. And we normally get about 1.5 million visitors a year to Stonehenge. But Stonehenge doesn't sit by itself. If we click on to the next slide, you can see that Stonehenge actually sits in a landscape that's full of other monuments too. So there are monuments such as this one, which is known as the Cursus, the Stonehenge Cursus, which is an early Neolithic monument. So it was built about 1,000 years before the stones at Stonehenge were put up. This huge, great big long earthwork enclosure, you might just be able to make out there, it looks like a kind of long, thin field. That's the Cursus monument. We don't really know what they're for, but they're some sort of ceremonial monument. And also in the landscape around Stonehenge, if you go to the next slide, are much later monuments. So monuments that came, we could slip, can we get, that's it, brilliant. So we've got monuments that were built in the early Bronze Age, so that's the period after Stonehenge was built. These are burial mounds. This particular cemetery is known as the Normanton Down Cemetery. And if you can see all those little bumps and circles, they are all Bronze Age barrows. So Stonehenge sits within a really complex landscape. And as you can see from some of these photographs, it sits within mostly grassland. You can go to the next slide, please. This is what some of the barrows look like up close. The landscape is looked after mostly by the National Trust, who work with their tenants and local farmers to preserve the archaeology in its best way as possible. And that involves not ploughing, no intensive agriculture, and basically restoring quite large areas of land to grassland, to this chalk grassland. If you can go to the next slide, this landscape is managed by the National Trust and by local landowners to really make the most of the traditional kind of environment. It was for a very, very long time, all through the medieval period, it was used for sheep farming, and that's what it's still used for largely today. And part of the reason that the land is managed in this particular way is to protect the archaeology, to protect the archaeology under the ground. But it's also because we think this is roughly what the landscape looked like in prehistory at the time that Stonehenge was built. The next slide. This is a visualization of what we think maybe the Stonehenge landscape looked like in the Neolithic period. People at this time were farmers. They had domestic cattle and they had domestic pigs. They grew crops. They were probably living quite mobile lifestyles. They weren't necessarily living in one permanent settlement. But we think that the area around Stonehenge was largely grassland. And Matt will explain a little bit more in a minute how we know that that's the case. So what the National Trust have done and what English Heritage do and some of the other local landowners do is try and revert back to natural chalk grassland. So it's not really natural in that it's grazed by animals and it's fairly well managed, but it is kept away from intensive agriculture and it's kept free of trees. So that it generally looks something like we think the landscape looked like in the period that Stonehenge was built. Right. Next slide, please. This is a visual that shows Stonehenge from the air in the year 2013, which was before a large project which English Heritage undertook to try and remove all of the modern things from next to Stonehenge. So if you visit Stonehenge today, all of that is gone. The road next to Stonehenge is gone, the car park's gone, the horrible toilets and the visitor centre is gone. And all this is part of this wider project to try and restore the landscape around Stonehenge and to get rid of the modern clutter and the modern vehicles and all of the things that go with it being a World Heritage Site from immediately close by to the stones. Next slide, please. So the fact that the land around Stonehenge is managed for archaeology means that it's very good for nature, it's good for wildlife. We get quite rare butterflies, the Adonis blue butterfly. Next slide, please. Marbled white butterflies, next slide. We also get mammals, we get hares a lot. This photograph I actually took on the morning that the young people were at Stonehenge filming their film that we're going to show in a minute. So we had some baby leverets, which were nestled up against the bottom of the stones, which were very cute. It's the only time I've taken a group into Stonehenge and they've been more excited by baby leveret hares than they had been by going inside Stonehenge. Next slide, please. There are also rare birds. So the RSPB have reserve just to the south of Stonehenge. This is especially important for stone curlews and for other kind of traditional farmland birds. Next slide, please. So on the whole, this is a landscape that is looked after for the archaeology, and we kind of manage it for the archaeology. But as a kind of byproduct of that, in a really good way, it also means that it's a brilliant chalk grassland for lots of different animals and birds. Okay, so that's kind of Stonehenge as it is today. Maya, I think you were going to ask a couple of questions.
Yeah, because I'm a really avid bird watcher, and I've heard about the Great Bustard Project on Salisbury Plains, where they've been reintroduced, and we've got like a few down in my area in Somerset. And I was just wondering if you got any near the Stonehenge, and also what other bird species you have.
Yeah, so if you can, we actually have the Great Bustard come and visit pretty regularly. So they were first reintroduced on Salisbury Plain, and they've got several successful breeding pairs, which is great. We actually have one called Gertie that visits so regularly to Stonehenge that our staff there have named her. And visitors are sometimes quite surprised by the fact this enormous turkey-like bird is wandering around the stones. So yeah, the Great Bustards have been a real success story. But when the land is managed, particularly for stone curlews, I think we've got a picture actually of Gertie in the next slide. Yeah, there we go. There's a picture from one of our staff members of Gertie at Stonehenge earlier this year, actually. Yes, so we can stop the slide share now. That's fine. So yeah, stone curlews, partridges, all kinds of other birds, owls particularly, and I think the kind of Great Bustard's a really good thing because it's sort of quite a famous project, and it kind of gets people's attention, even though it's quite an unusual bird to actually see. It kind of raises the awareness of why it's an important area.
Yeah. Can I ask another question? Sorry.
Yeah.
I was wondering, like, how much of this information about the local wildlife is available to the visitors and tourists coming, and if so, what they think about the landscape.
Oh, well, that's really interesting because we don't at English Heritage tend to focus a huge amount on the nature and the wildlife, and perhaps we ought to do more. Although the National Trust do have a really lovely leaflet that they produce, which has got all of the bird species you can see, and there's a huge amount of information on their website and some suggested walks that you can do around the area, which is great. Actually, a lot of our visitors are quite not used to being in such a kind of open rural landscape, and particularly our overseas visitors are really amazed to see sheep. They don't necessarily have sheep in places like Japan, and they love sheep to the extent that we actually sell woolly sheep in our gift shop because they find them really interesting. They want to take photos of the sheep, and you can understand if it's an animal that you're not used to, and so things that might seem really familiar and quite boring to us tend to be a lot more exciting for our international visitors. But also they're not as confident about going about the landscape as we might be. So we're quite used to public footpaths, and the land around Stonehenge is actually managed open access, so you can walk wherever you like in it, but you tend to not get the confidence from international visitors to actually go out and explore the landscape, so we have to work quite hard to encourage people to walk and to get out and to see some of the rest of the landscape.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, great. So I mentioned there that we think that Stonehenge was built in an area that was pretty much open grassland. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Matt, who's going to explain with some slides how it is that archaeologists know about what an environment was like in the past.
Okay, thank you. Yes, next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So if you think about an archaeological dig, you'll know that a lot of the evidence is underground. So some of the things that are underground would have been deliberately buried. You can think of skeletons and graves, for example. But a lot of other things have just become buried through time because new sediment is deposited on top of them. That could be because there's been flooding. It could be soil that's been loosened by ploughing, washing down a slope. It could be the action of earthworms that leave casts on the ground surface. But over time, these create a series of layers. And actually, could we go back to the slide before quickly? They create a series of layers from the modern ground surface down to the rock. And archaeologists have ways of extracting these layers. So there's a couple of people in one of the middle photos there using a piece of coring equipment. And then the next photo on the grass is showing one of those cores that's been extracted. So it's a 1 meter chunk of what's buried under the ground. And then the furthest photo on from that shows an archaeological site, another way of getting this kind of intact evidence out of the ground using tins. You can do the same thing, the coring with ice as well in glaciers or ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland. And that's how we understand, because you can trace a record of snowfall every year. And you can see air bubbles trapped in that contain atmospheric gases. That's how we understand things like the fact that we now have the highest atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations in 800,000 years. The next slide, please. So once you've got those back to a laboratory, it's simply a matter of looking at the soil and sediment and working out what kind of story they tell, and disaggregating them, breaking it up either in water or sometimes in harsher chemicals like hydrofluoric acid, to see what's preserved in there, what remains of living organisms. And you can pass them through sieves, different sized meshes, to catch different kinds of remains. So the range of remains runs from the very microscopic, such as pollen and spores of fungi, up to the bones of large animals like pigs, cows, and sheep. So could I have the next slide, please? And what you will find often depends on the conditions in the soil. So bones and shells are more likely to be preserved where there's lots of calcium carbonate, such as where the geology is chalk, which it is at Stonehenge. Things like seeds, beetles, pollen are more likely to be preserved in very wet places like bogs. So this picture is a sheep skull. It's from the island of North Ronaldsay in Scotland. And I'm just showing it really as evidence of one of the larger things that we could find. Larger animal bones like this are usually most helpful to tell us about farming in the past and what kinds of foods people were eating. Can I have the next slide, please? Another way things can be preserved, and especially plants, is by charring. So these pictures show us charred cereal grains. Again, they tell us about what people were eating, but weed seeds can also be charred in amongst the cereal. So they tell us what kind of plants grew in the environment and tell us a bit more about the environment. And could I have the next slide, please? The work that I do, and in the case of Stonehenge, because it's on this chalk geology and there aren't many conditions where pollen survives, is looking at snail shells. Snail shells can be very tiny, often only 4 or 5 millimeters. And in a chalk landscape like Stonehenge, there can be hundreds in a sample. So the number 687 on my clicker there, that's just one species of snail within a sample. There were thousands of snails within that sample. They're useful because there are about 200 species of snail that live in Britain, and the different species of snail have different environments that they like to live in. So some prefer very shady conditions, some like much more open grassland environments. And so if we see how this mixture of species changes through time, it lets us understand how the environment has changed. To understand how the environment has changed at Stonehenge, I think it's useful to go back to a time long before people were living there. Over the past just over 2.5 million years, the planet has gone through a series of very drastic changes between what we call glacial periods, where there was lots more ice, ice sheets over most of Northern Europe and North America, into interglacial periods, the warmer periods in between. And during the last glacial period, which ended about 11,000 years ago, the landscape at Stonehenge, the ground would have been permanently frozen all through the year, with just the upper meter or so thawing in the spring and then freezing again in the summer. So there weren't very many plants that were able to live there, and there certainly weren't any snails. But over the next 2,000 years, as the climate warmed, different tree species were able to colonize the landscape, starting with the kinds of trees that we see in northern Scandinavia now, so pine and juniper and birch, before the landscape of oak and hazel and elm began to grow. In the early 20th century, people started to study pollen samples and began to understand this kind of succession and reached a conclusion that there was a point before farming where the British landscape would have been covered in quite a lush forest in warm climate, warm, humid climatic conditions. However, with Stonehenge, there was something of an assumption that because it's open grassland now, it would have been open grassland there as well. Apologies if you can hear my neighbour, incidentally. Doesn't seem happy. As the years have gone on, there's been more and more work in the Stonehenge landscape, and people started to understand, particularly through looking at snails, that yes, there was woodland, but actually a lot of the monuments that are built were built in a landscape that had already been cleared for quite some time. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is, I think, probably about 5,500 years ago, and the horizontal line you can see in the middle is the cursus that Sue mentioned earlier. And you can see that on the higher ground there are some trees. There's also some trees in valleys towards the front of the picture, but in general it's quite an open environment. So shortly before this, around about 6,000 years ago, agriculture was introduced to Britain, and this meant that land came to be given over to either pasture for livestock or ploughed and used for crops. Particularly in the Stonehenge landscape, there seems to be a lot of pasture, but it wasn't a continuous process. It wasn't a particularly quick process of land clearance, and it wasn't a continuous process. So there were times that woodland would have regenerated. But if we go on to the next slide, please. By the time that the Stonehenge monument, effectively as we know and love it today, which is a dot in the center just in front of the cursus on this picture, by the time that that was built, you can see that it's in a largely open landscape, and the landscape is littered with monuments. So this is, I think, about 4,500 years ago, this image, perhaps a little less. I think that's all. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt. Right, Myra, did you have any queries about what Matt's just been telling us?
Yes, always. I was actually wondering whether, like, looking into the past climates of an area is quite common for archaeologists or not, like if that's something they always do.
It is quite common, yes. So there's archaeology is done in Britain through a range of different ways, one of which is part of the planning process, so ahead of new building projects and things like that. And another is university research projects, and these can be quite variable in terms of what their aims are and what they're looking for, but generally there will be samples of the soil and sediments taken, and people will look at what kind of biological remains are preserved. But again, as I said, it also depends where in the country you're working. So different parts of the country, we would expect different things to be preserved. So snails that I love to look at, you won't find many of those in most of Wales, for example, because the geology just isn't right. Does that help? Yeah,
it does, thank you. And you kind of answered this, but I'm still quite interested. I was wondering what you were saying about, but I'm not sure what your opinion is on rewilding in the first place as an archaeologist. But I was quite interested about what you were saying, how like really long ago it was the lush forests and stuff in Britain, but then also quite long ago it was like these grasslands and these fields with farmers and stuff. And like guess, I'm not sure if you even know the answer to this, but I was wondering if we did want to revert areas of the UK back to somewhere that was better for the environment, which of the two would we even go for in the first place? Yes.
Okay. Well, I think both provide really important services to the environment in general, and we've seen from the slides that Sue showed earlier how amazing chalkland grassland is as a habitat. But equally, woodland has a really important role, particularly in upland areas with soil conservation and preventing erosion, and that later leads to flooding in the lowlands. The evidence that archaeologists and ecologists are leaning towards now is that closed canopy dense forest was not the case in southern Britain, and that actually there were far more clearances maintained by things like storms blowing trees over and lightning strikes. So there's evidence of wildfires even before there were people, and large herbivores that lived in the landscape like red deer and aurochs, which is the wild ancestor of cattle, can help maintain those clearings as well. So the natural state, I suppose, is to have a mixture of both in our landscape. But in terms of rewilding, I'm very much in favour. Some species are, I think, our landscape has developed having certain species in it, such as beavers, for example, and they've been important controls on flooding certainly in river systems quite close to me.
Really interesting question. I remember last week I was reading about them introducing bisons back into Kent, and I was thinking, I wonder what the archaeological evidence is for bison and apparently there are some in the Isle of Wight and also in Doggerland, which is now under the North Sea. But yeah, things like, I guess archaeologists have something to kind of add in some ways to kind of the history of different species and which areas they've been living in and how, which ones we might choose to bring back in for different. Okay, so we're going to end our little discussion for a minute, and we're going to watch the first 2 and a bit minutes of the film. This is the Stonehenge 3019 film that was made by young people last year. They were working with a group of artists called Sleep Dogs to create this film. And don't forget, if you've got any questions, keep sending them through, keep commenting on the YouTube video, and we'll try and answer them.
Stonehenge, 3019. Another bright grey day, the sky low to the ground. The sunlight refracts through subtly designed clouds and over the stones, both the real ones and the ghosts. Usually I work in the gravity core under the visitor centre. I make sure the ghost stones appear in the right place, that they look correct from every angle. But sometimes, every now and then, I get to greet the visitors, and this morning I'm handing out the Augmented Reality headsets. These new models are designed to fit every kind of species, adaptable to many head shapes and skull sizes. They even fit over electric tendrils and things that don't always look like heads. We smile at everyone. Some of these visitors were born 5 light years away, yet still feel compelled to make a pilgrimage to Stonehenge. There are enough bodies through the gates to keep me and my team employed, but Stonehenge is quiet these days. It's a shame. The stones are the oldest surviving human construction on the planet now. Many of them are still the originals. A few were lost thanks to lichen collapse in the 2160s. Some were broken up during the North European Sand Wars, but there's still 2 complete trilithons, most of the Sarsens, and I think me and my crew do a pretty good job of holographically generating the rest. The trees around the site are mostly made from intelligent silicon, and the insects are nanobionic. If I'm honest, it's the birds I'm most proud of. We grow a fresh batch in a vat each year, so they change up, they have little inconsistencies. It's almost as if they might have been breeding in the wild, as if that were possible any longer. Best of all,
unmute myself. So that gives you a little insight into what the film was that has been created by the young people from around Stonehenge. We'll show the full film at the end of this event, and I really recommend sticking around to watch the whole thing because it's got a good story arc and it's really special. So what we've got now is one of the young people, Sarah, who was involved in that project. Sarah, do you want to unmute yourself and we could ask you a few questions about what it was like to work with sleep dogs? Hiya.
Yeah. Hi.
Thanks for coming and being on our little YouTube video. So you were involved, you were one of the young people, you live near Stonehenge, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what was it like filming inside Stonehenge? Did you get to go and actually use kind of camera equipment and microphones and record things there?
Yeah, we did. We got to go use like some. Yeah, we got to go use like some microphone equipment and like listen up close to the rocks and like see all like the patterns that you can't see from a distance. It was quite nice. It was really like nice to do.
And was that the first time that you visited Stonehenge, or was it just the first time that you went inside the stone circle?
It was the first time I visited Stonehenge.
But it's somewhere that you've maybe seen from driving past on the road a few times.
Yeah.
And how did it work? How did you get some of the ideas? Because that's a really, I mean, even those first couple of minutes, it's got quite a lot of ideas about what the future might be like, about kind of future extinctions, about where did you get some of the ideas from? Did it kind of come out in a workshop?
Yeah, like it came out, I think, like the first few days when we were all together, like we all had like a timeline and we all like just put some random ideas up which we thought, and then it just kind of started building up and building.
It's got some really kind of nice ideas. I like the birds, and it's just I think it's a really cool film. So I think it's a really good way of thinking about kind of trying to use our imaginations to think about what on earth places might look like in the future.
Yeah.
Is this the first time you've seen the full film? Have you had a little preview yourself already? Do you know what it looks like?
Yeah, we had a preview all together at the end of our workshop and we all watched it.
And were you all really pleased with it?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. And how did climate change come about? Was that just something that was in your minds anyway, or was it kind of influenced a little bit by some of the things that have been happening in the world, particularly last year?
It kind of like brought it up slowly, like with like the rain and the clouds, and it goes sunny, and it kind of brought some ideas. Like some people thought it would be like it's like Stonehenge is trying to like push us further away from it with the rain and like just things like that, and it just built it up and built it up. So yeah, I think it did have a really big impact on our ideas. Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah. And I think when everyone gets the chance to see the film later on, they'll be really amazed at what you guys managed to achieve. So thank you. You're free to stick around and stay on the screen, or you can disappear and go and watch the rest of this event on YouTube. Okay, so bye. See you, Sarah. So I'm going to open up for a bit of discussion now. So what did you think, Maya Rose, to the little bit of film that you've seen? I think you might have both seen the full film as well, so you might have a bit of a better idea about some of the ideas. Do you want to go first, Maya Rose?
Yeah, I think the first thing that really stood out to me was the fact that even in 1,000 years' time, when this relic of the past is like crumbling and it's half gone, there are still people visiting, and there's still people coming from light years away to come and see this. And to me, I don't know, that just was really interesting, like the fact that we're always going to have this fascination with the past, even if we don't necessarily look after it or maintain it in the best way.
Yeah, I was really struck by the fact that the narrator said it's much quieter now, which is actually exactly what it is now, because unbeknownst to the filmmakers who were doing this project last year, Stonehenge is surprisingly a lot quieter than you might think. Because of the lack of international tourism due to COVID-19. So that's got some interesting things to think about in terms of kind of international tourism and things, which we might talk about a little bit more. Do you want to chip in, Matt? Was any of your first reactions to the film?
Yeah, actually something very similar to what Maya Rose thought, but also how interested people or beings in the future are in the authenticity of the natural elements, in recreating the animal life and the environment. I thought that was really interesting. And yeah, again, that sense that that is something that we really value in places that we go to visit.
Yeah, the digital insects are quite cool.
Yeah.
And the fact that I guess the young people had imagined that these things all had to be recreated because they no longer existed. So they're basically saying that mass extinction is something that they think is going to play out. And you want to chip in, Maya Rose? I mean, mass extinction is something that's kind of on the horizon, isn't it? So
yeah, it's funny because in a weird way, all these like birds being created and that and stuff made me feel like it was a very distorted version of rewilding, which we were talking about, but where it's not for the sake of, you know, making somewhere that's much more environmentally stable and somewhere that maybe will be there in 1,000 years, but rather purely for the aesthetics of it all. And for me, that sort of reminds me of this conversation that a lot of people are having at the moment about like what actually is environmentalism and what we're doing for the sake of being green, I suppose. But yeah, I don't know. I think in some ways, I can't really picture what humanity's going to do if we allow it to get to the point where really everything's going extinct. Because I feel like in a lot of dystopia, it's always this thing where we've reverted back to being like cavemen and we're living in huts and stuff. But honestly, we're probably going to have this amazing technology and we're managing to survive somehow in a natureless world. And I just can't picture it at all, really.
I thought it was really interesting when it mentioned the North European sand wars, which I guess sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel, but I can imagine, you know, human conflict because of climate change is something that is definitely already in existence and will be over things like water shortages and land shortages, I guess. So the fact that they had imagined that that would extend to places like Northern Europe, where we tend to think of ourselves as not being quite so vulnerable, it was interesting. I thought. Going back to our kind of discussion about rewilding, and they had the kind of birds and animals there that were kind of digital rewilding. I guess one of the things that that archaeology can tell us is about how animal species and insect and bird species have adapted in the past. Do you want to say a bit more about that, Matt? I think you mentioned before there was a particular things that can tell us that animals were living in particular climates and adapted over time or not.
Yes. Yes. So one thing to say is through the time that people have been in Britain, there's not been a lot of speciation, so new species arising here from older species. But what there has been is lots and lots of new species either going locally extinct or arriving, and the kind of trend that we're seeing mostly through globalization, but also climate change is since the middle of the 20th century, lots of new invertebrate species, some of them quite problematic as competitors with other species, arriving in ecosystems. I wanted to kind of dial back to this idea of creating species and that technological rewilding, because there is a movement that some people are very keen on, I'm a lot less keen on, called de-extinction, where we use DNA effectively to bring back, in a Jurassic Park kind of scenario, but bring back animals that would have been alive at the times that people were first beginning to spread into the northern world, so mammoths, so that the idea that you can find mammoths preserved in tundra and extract DNA from them and use an elephant as a surrogate the same way that Dolly the sheep was cloned effectively. And I find that really problematic because the kinds of ecosystems they lived in just don't exist on Earth anymore. So effectively, you're creating an animal for the purpose of showing it off, which doesn't sit very comfortably with me at all. So in a way, I'd prefer this technological reinvention of a virtualized animal.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. There's slightly less ethics involved in a digital recreation, I guess. Maybe, I don't know. What about and we've got lots of questions coming in from the public, so I want to make sure we get time to answer some of those in a minute. But just one last kind of area to talk about is the fact that obviously at the moment, because of COVID-19, we haven't got as many international tourists coming to Stonehenge, which is a bit of a problem for English heritage in terms of our income, but it's actually good for the site because it lets it kind of recover a bit. And it's quite an interesting question about kind of tourism and whether kind of how we can make tourism more sustainable for the future. And, you know, should we be having, you know, what impact does World Heritage have? It basically means it becomes a kind of honeypot site that everybody wants to come and visit. And that means that, you know, people come from China and America and everywhere around the world to come and visit our sites, which is great. But I think there's I think it was 2030, they think there's going to be 1.3 billion global tourists, which is just astonishing. And the amount of travel and kind of airplanes and the impact of that on our planet is pretty astonishing. So I don't know if either of you wanted to say anything about what you're thinking about that, about the fact that they had less tourists in 1,000 years' time is probably.
I think for me, like, tourism is quite a difficult issue. And like you're saying, it's like this ridiculous number of people pouring in. It's bad for the climate, but it is also bad for the site. But I think it can be done in a really positive way. Like, I've been very lucky. I've traveled quite a lot and I've been to some of these amazing sites. And if places have been set up really well and they're really sustainable and they're really eco-friendly, in many ways it can have a much more positive impact on the environment and also the local area than if there wasn't anything at all. And I think, you know, there's always ways to make things sustainable, whether it's like, I don't know, setting up a direct rail from London or like, I don't know, something else. But I think, like, in terms of education, it's also very important. But like personally, my opinion's always like, if they didn't come here, they'd probably go somewhere else. And even though maybe numbers should definitely be limited, because the last thing we want is for a site to be damaged. At the same time, I think because people are still coming in, or will be after COVID, you know, it's the best we can do is take advantage of that and teach them about, you know, the history of the site and the climate change and the local environment, and just, you know, make it educational in that way.
Yeah, it's a good way of thinking about it. I think we could definitely do more about encouraging sustainable visits and encouraging people to use different types of transport. Stonehenge is kind of quite remote, so public transport is not great. So yeah, it's something that we've been thinking about for a long time, but there isn't that easy solutions at the moment. Okay, I think what we'll do now is swap to some of our public questions, and I'm going to have to kind of look at my screen to be able to read the questions, and then I'll fire them through. So these are questions that have come in. Some of them are directed to all of us, and some of them are directed just to specific ones of us. So we've got a question for Matt, which is about your reference to Jurassic Park. Regarding the rewilding and the Jurassic Park style recreations of animals, what other kinds of animals have they proposed bringing back? So I don't know if that might be a question relating to what people are proposing to bring back to the British Isles, or yeah. So I've mentioned about bison before, and we've talked about beavers. And
yes, so obviously in terms of species that are currently around, we've obviously had very successful reintroductions of kites and great bustards and egrets, but smaller trial introductions of beavers. People that will talk about reintroducing wolves as a possibility, reintroducing lynxes as well. In terms of the fully extinct species, I think I'm not a geneticist, so those are the people best qualified to answer this question. But my understanding is that there needs to be a closely related living relative that can act as a surrogate. So mammoths are a good contender because they're relatively closely related to elephants. We also had woolly rhinoceroses and hyenas in Britain during glacial and interglacial periods. So those potentially are a species that could be brought back.
Cool. Okay, a question from Maya Rose. This is a question coming. How can people get involved in combating climate change, especially in lockdown? Somebody's basically in lockdown at home thinking, what can they do to help?
I think obviously to an extent it's very difficult to combat it as a single person, because a lot of the issue of climate change is to do with like massive companies and institutions. But I think the best thing is just to really think about like sustainability, and especially in terms of consumerism, like thinking about the things you buy, the things you eat, where they come from. And so for example, being vegan isn't necessarily the best option if you're eating soya that's been flown in from South America, and it's better to buy eggs from your local farm. And I think just really having a deep think about the ways that you could personally be impacting the climate. And at the end of the day, it's very difficult, like when you're not, like, I don't know, rich, for example, to combat all of your contributions to climate change. But I think at the end of the day, we're all just trying to do our best and change our habits.
Great, thank you. There's a comment come in for you, Matt. It says, I watched a lecture the other day. This is from Holly. She says, I watched a lecture the other day and it included snails. I didn't realise how important they were to archaeology before. I just never linked snails and their various breeds inhabiting different areas and how much it can tell us. It's fab. She doesn't got a question. She just wants to tell you how fab snails are.
Well, that's always good to hear.
Okay, we're going to do one more question, this is one for kind of me, I guess, or all of us, which is, what's the biggest challenge facing Stonehenge in the future? So I guess from my point of view, there are challenges coming up about traffic and transport in the local area, and which we're still waiting for kind of news about. There are also issues relating to tourism and relating to kind of how do we make visiting Stonehenge really sustainable option. And actually lockdown is forcing us to work in different ways and getting, encouraging local people to come visit projects like this, which is our Shout Out Loud project, which is getting young people from the local area involved in their local sites and their local heritage, and getting them to kind of think about what it means to have their heritage on their doorstep and be involved in kind of projects that get them to put their voices across is a really good way to kind of combat that. But I think we've got a lot of work to do kind of in engaging kind of local visitors and our local community, and I think, yeah, we'll see how it goes over the next few months, whether we ever get back to the kind of normal numbers of 1.5 million is interesting to think about, or whether this is kind of a dip that kind of continues on for a long while. So yeah, that'll be a challenge for us at English Heritage to kind of navigate through. So interesting times. Okay, so what we're going to do now is move on to show you the full video. Before I do that, we've just got a few extra things I've got to say. Sorry, I'm looking up my script here to make sure I do everything properly. So thank you so much for your amazing questions. There were quite a few that came in that we didn't have a chance to answer, so I'm sorry about that, but we'll try and perhaps get back to you in the YouTube comments. We'd love you all to fill in an evaluation question, which is in the chat below the YouTube. So if you're watching this now, please fill it in if you can. Thank you very much to the people who've been involved. So thank you to Sarah, who was the young person who came on and told us about making the film. Thank you to Matt and to Maya Rose. And thank you for watching. And thank you very much to the Shout Out Loud funders, the Heritage Lottery Fund. So we hope you enjoy the film, Stonehenge 3019.
Stonehenge, 3019. Another bright grey day, the sky low to the ground. The sunlight refracts through subtly designed clouds and over the stones, both the real ones and the ghosts. Usually I work in the gravity core under the visitor centre. I make sure the ghost stones appear in the right place, that they look correct from every angle. But sometimes, every now and then, I get to greet the visitors, and this morning I'm handing out the Augmented Reality headsets. These new models are designed to fit every kind of species, adaptable to many head shapes and skull sizes. They even fit over electric tendrils and things that don't always look like heads. We smile at everyone. Some of these visitors were born 5 light years away, yet still feel compelled to make a pilgrimage to Stonehenge. There are enough bodies through the gates to keep me and my team employed, but Stonehenge is quiet these days. It's a shame. The stones are the oldest surviving human construction on the planet now. Many of them are still the originals. A few were lost thanks to lichen collapse in the 2160s. Some were broken up during the North European Sand Wars, but there's still 2 complete trilithons, most of the Sarsens, and I think me and my crew do a pretty good job of holographically generating the rest. The trees around the site are mostly made from intelligent silicon, and the insects are nanobionic. If I'm honest, it's the birds I'm most proud of. We grow a fresh batch in a vat each year, so they change up, they have little inconsistencies. It's almost as if they might have been breeding in the wild, as if that were possible any longer. Best of all, when you wear those headsets, you get a complete tactile reconstruction of everything the stone circle ever was, fed directly to your brain with handy additional information. A voice in a language of your choosing whispers soft facts into your ear. You can touch the ghost stones, that's allowed, but a force field prevents you from getting too close to the genuine articles. The headsets are regulated by the gravity core, which is calibrated to extend back 1,000 years only, so as not to overload our visitors with the sheer scale of history. Further back than that, people stop understanding what they're seeing. They get discombobulated. Thing is, even with all this tech, we still can't work out why Stonehenge was built in the first place. History is dark. So our visitors are presented with simple options, just the history we know. As you stand before the stone circle, you can switch parts of it on and off, and the gravity core retrieves images from key dates, say 2715, when a neighbour species first saw the stones, or 2840, when the site was temporarily housed in an underwater dome, or 2065, when the robot security guards were introduced. You can watch people long dead, from times long gone, standing right next to you, contemplating the same mysteries as you. You can dial up the volume on their voices, languages lost for hundreds of years, crystal clear. The reconstruction is impeccable. At the end of the day, once the crowds have left, I like to sit close to the circle, put on a headset, and watch my favourite slice of the timeline from 2019. It's the furthest back you can go on the current settings. Just a quiet morning in the centre of the circle, and some young folk are documenting the stones. Fragments of conversation, strange ideas, but I like the sound of it.
That's for a UFO. That's for aliens, right there.
Maybe it's a library of secret knowledge. If somebody was buried here, maybe these are all gravestones.
I was filming it when there was a ray of light like a laser beam.
They're dressed weirdly, they have extremely odd hair. I think I just like seeing them rush around because we don't get so many young folk up here anymore.
The birds are spying on the humans, they're working for the aliens.
The gaps between the stones are portals. If you're here at the right time, you can walk through to another dimension.
All we know is that it's about the longest day and the shortest day.
We've set the gravity core to go no further back than this morning, this small moment 1,000 years ago, but I wish I could find out what brought them here. So, in the night, quietly, I go down to the core chamber. I reset the instrument panel, just a little, just a flicker in the passage of time, to see a tiny bit further back. I inform the security guards that I'm checking the headsets. It's just maintenance. They don't care anyway. They're literally robots. They can't see what I'm seeing. I wind 2019 back a few minutes. The young folk approach the stones. There's a light drizzle of what they used to call rain. They use a strange, ancient microphone to capture errant radio waves, seeing what the bluestones pick up. They look at leverets, which are the young of an extinct species called a hare, nesting at the base of a trilithon. But I learn nothing new about these hengelings. Nothing about why they came here, what it meant to them. Well, maybe that's all right. I take off the headset, I return to the gravity core chamber, I reset the limits of history at Stonehenge once more. But I make a mistake. There's something I miss. There's one tiny virtual dial that I don't return to zero. And after I've left, overnight, the core spends hours feeding on history, reconstructing older and older images from gravitational waves. It acquires everything it can, all of Stonehenge's past, thousands and thousands of years. And it waits for the site to open again in the morning. Stonehenge, 3019. A bright grey day, and quite busy by our standards. A few hundred people at the circle, voices in many languages. I settle in for a standard working pattern, but then I can tell something's wrong just by watching the way people stand by the stones. I don't have a headset myself, so for a moment all I can say for sure is bodies are angled strangely, necks craned, looking to places we normally don't program any history ghosts. Neighbour species are laughing, pointing above the sarsen's, waving at the empty air over the lintels. And then everything around, all the chatter, stops. I dash to the gate and grab a headset, and once I put it on, the landscape around and within Stonehenge
explodes with light.
Centuries of images.
Things that have happened here.
Things that never happened here.
Ideas that happened here.
Theories and fairy tales.
People who built it.
People who broke it. People who came to see.
Everything visible all at once.
An Anglo-Saxon man loses his head and is buried in the dead centre.
The stones flicker out of existence altogether. Only a set of post holes within the ditch remain. Then
A UFO lands, and it's aliens that built Stonehenge.
which they told us they didn't actually do, but there it is in front of me, and
A portal opens, and it leads to another Stonehenge, on another world.
which definitely hasn't happened yet, but also,
People dance on the lintels over the Sarsen Circle.
and that's from the mid-20th century, which I know is history proper, and
Winston Churchill poses by the heelstone.
why is this happening? This isn't curated. This isn't official business. I run as fast as I can to the gravity core and its bunker. I frantically consult manuals and I try to work out what gives. Then I see it. A glaring error from last night. But worse still. Not only has it captured all of proven history, it's also captured what was in people's minds. Everything anyone who came here ever thought. It's captured imaginations and questions, theories and fairy tales, throwing fact and fiction into the timeline, and everyone's headsets are suddenly showing everything. Needless to say, my boss is furious. She tells me, this is no longer a carefully curated experience. She points out the Dayglow druidesses dancing in the circle, the grumpy wizards, the dinosaur for some reason, the executions, the rock concerts, the bouncy castle, etc. Get it back to normal, she says, and make it acceptable again, or clear your desk. As she storms out, I can hear the sound of a strange music drifting through the air. I can't tell what time zone it comes from. It somehow calms me. The readouts in front of me dance like crazy. All of this history, all of these ideas in one tiny, tiny spot on a nondescript curve of this funny little planet. Sure, there's science and study and the things we can say for sure.
It's been here for thousands of years.
People came from miles to be here.
It was built over more than one lifetime.
It lines up to the longest day and the shortest.
These are facts, but I wonder if there's anywhere else in the universe like this, where so many people come to see something whose story is so lost, where they have so little information as to what it really, truly means. And you might call what I do next sabotage or vandalism. I mean, what's to say the headset should only show what we know? People don't have to wear them. They can just look at the naked stones if they want to, no bells or whistles. So I hack the core controls, fix them so they can't be changed back, then I clear my desk. And I go back to the stone circle to watch the chaos. Sure, people are going crazy, but only a few of them in a bad way. Most seem delighted. They dance with unseen figures, they gasp as some of the stones collapse, they watch storms lash the trilithons, they watch generations of footsteps slowly eroding the tumble-down rocks. After a while, I put on my own headset, and for a moment, among all the other ghosts, I think I can see the young folks from 2019 running around the inner circle, shouting jokes, whispering, waving microphones, making up new ideas. What I don't know, what I can't know, here and now, is that in the weeks to come, this carnival of images, both real and imagined, will bring many, many more visitors to Stonehenge. My ex-boss will keep the site open rather than lose face, and word of mouth will spread far and wide, eventually inspiring a whole new generation of hengelings. Sure, not everything they'll see in the circle is factual, real, tangible, provable. But guess what? Here under this low sky, among these quiet stones, that's always been so.